What's Up, proudly presented by Master Electricians. Welcome to the Master Electricians podcast, What's Up? June is Business Recovery Month, proudly sponsored by Fleetpin.
So Master Electricians is starting our podcast series. We're rolling these out weekly, and our first podcast will be introducing a key advocate of ours and someone that we advocate for as well as Business New Zealand. They're an important cog in the advocacy wheel for everything in business, and they've supported Master Electricians over some very key aspects of what we've been to government with over the last few months. In New Zealand, they're the largest business advocacy body. Nearly all industry associations are involved with Business New Zealand in some way, and Master Electricians is part of the affiliated industries group. They're one of the four main advocacy sections of Business New Zealand. So we actually contribute to the 76,000 employers and businesses that are members. And that is from the smallest to the largest of businesses, spanning across the spectrum of the New Zealand economy. There are many more aspects to Business New Zealand, but I'll leave that to Paul McKay to fill in any bits that I've missed. But Paul is the manager for employment relations and policy at Business New Zealand. So I'll get you, Paul, I think, to give us the elevator pitch of your career and experience, just so that we give it the proper justice it deserves. So I'll hand over to you for a moment, Paul.
Thanks, Bernie. Yes, so I've been in the employment relations space now for well over 30 years. And for those that recall the 90s with the advent of things like the Employment Contracts Act, all the way through tomorrow's schools and all the way through the big reforms of the state sector. So a number of years in the state sector working on those sorts of issues, working in the electricity sector on the transformation of the state-owned energy side of government into Electricorp, and then finally into its current form. And in a number of years in Carter Old Harvey as a multinational forest products company, at the time the second largest company in New Zealand, and spanning operations in China, Australia and New Zealand. So a good deal of cuts and bruises from a 30-year career, and hopefully we can talk about some of the things that are relevant now.
Yeah, sure. I guess being involved in government in the early days will give you some pretty good insights to the inner workings and how to get some stuff done.
One of the things that Business New Zealand does is it interfaces with government and government officials. They're our primary audience. So other regional associations and the Master Electricians, for instance, are very much business facing. They're member facing. Business New Zealand's primary job is to help advocate for business by advocating to government. So we spend a lot of our time with ministers, with government officials, and with the union movement too, because of course the workers are the other half of the equation for employers. And so our job is to make sure we sit alongside and with them, working through the issues and trying to convince them that there's a balance required that is good for business and good for workers and good for the economy.
Yeah, and it's an amazing tool for us to enable us to have that access to some of the reaches of government where we just can find it very difficult to get to. So I'd guess, as you mentioned, the current environment, it would be good to touch on, I think, this COVID area, and maybe also some of the pre-COVID environments that business has been in, and that's really just so we can get maybe a handle on how business has changed from then to now and where we've got to go forward to. So maybe looking at SMEs like in the COVID area, have we got any indications of how many businesses will fail?
Not in a numerical sense, but we're certainly seeing a large number of redundancies in across the sectors, and we've seen some even large businesses laying off significant numbers of staff. The big issue for SMEs is the old issue of cash flow, and that is every business that can't pay its bills is going to be struggling, and many SMEs are reliant on day-to-day income to keep their businesses afloat. So I think we can expect to see not only more redundancies, but certainly more businesses failing in the near term, while people adjust to different access to different markets or the loss of the markets they've currently got. But certainly as we move forward, SMEs are probably the best place to take advantage of regrowth in the New Zealand domestic market, because that's what SMEs do most. They work in domestic markets. So while there's a period of pain ahead, growth and the success of the future economy is going to very much depend on the agility of SMEs to either rebrand themselves, regrow themselves, or reinvent themselves.
Yeah, I think that's going to be quite critical, and we've thrashed on quite considerably over the last little while about cash flow and just reiterating how important it is to a business. But in this period, do you think that trade companies, with the nature of the essential nature of what they do and of building New Zealand, are they any more resilient or safe compared to others, as whether they're going to have less chance of failing compared to others?
I think there's going to be two sorts of answers to that, one based on people and one based on the business itself. For instance, construction at the moment, we know that there's going to be a lot of construction activity as part of the government's investment in rebuilding, but we also know that there's a tremendous shortage of labour, skilled labour, and therefore there's going to be pressure and price pressure put on the ability to get any particular project done. There will be competition for scarce domestic trade skills, which will be good for those who have those scarce skills, but not necessarily good for the businesses that are trying to attract contracts and projects, because if they can't acquire those skills, then they won't be in that business for very long. So overall, we're going to be very, very hard done. It's going to be hard work because of the inability to bring migrant labour in, as we have in the past. Across the sectors, trades particularly, we've seen through this, the Christchurch rebuild and the Auckland infrastructure rebuilds, the reliance we've had on overseas skilled labour, trades labour, has been huge. And of course, many of those have now gone home, and those that are still here haven't got work to work on. So we've got to, A, create the projects for people to work on, and B, we've got to access what we can and grow more of what we need here in this country. And things like the apprenticeship side of things, the welcome news from the government in the budget that there's going to be significant investment in trades training apprenticeships is going to be very, very important as we go forward.
Yeah, and I think that's probably some of the best news ever, and it's something that we've, as an industry association, have been trying to lobby government for a while to support that apprenticeship structure. And I guess that will provide maybe some sort of resilience to the trades companies with, for the likes of the support of the apprentices and the wage subsidy and the extension of the wage subsidy, which I think is a fantastic initiative. Do you think that will make any difference to helping companies stay afloat for just that little bit longer till they can get some workflow sorted out?
It should, but there's a couple of caveats to that. One is the current subsidy, of course, expires in June, and the second subsidy is harder to get because there's a higher threshold. You have to have lost more, 50% rather than 30%, before you can attract it. So whether or not people will meet that criteria will depend on whether they can continue to access the subsidy. The other one, though, is that if you can't find the work to apply that to keep people alive or their employment alive for, then the subsidy won't ultimately help. And so one of the things I think that will be very important in the apprenticeship space, for instance, is that apprenticeships are not specifically tied to employers, but rather to employment. And what I mean by that is, there will be businesses that fail. And if they've got apprentices attached to them, even under the government subsidy scheme, those apprentices will fall out of the system and not be available to anybody else. So finding ways of making sure that the apprenticeship investment is done in a way that apprentices are kept viable in terms of their learning and their ability to then become viable workers, rather than being attached to a company that might fail and losing those workers. So there'll be a lot of work to do, and certainly Business New Zealand will be advocating strongly for making sure that the greatest value possible can be achieved through that apprenticeship investment.
Yeah, I think that is an absolute critical cog in solving the skilled worker shortage, is to keep that training coming through in light of the fact that we don't have those unskilled labour workforce coming into the country now. So it'll be good. We've been advocating for a while, and I'd be interested to hear how, if you've heard anything from inside government, how we could incentivise businesses to take on apprentices, or at the moment what they're trying to do is incentivise businesses to keep those trainees on the wages, because often these are the part of the labour force which is first off when times get hard, and that's a travesty, because they're a critical part to fixing our trade shortage. So is this incentivisation, do you think it will actually be pushed out wider by government to help companies keep apprentices?
Well, it certainly needs to be more than just the subsidy, because what the subsidy will do, as you said, will allow people to keep people they've already got. What we really need is for businesses to want more of them, because they've got work coming in that they can't meet with the current workforce that they've been able to keep. So growth in terms of job opportunities, in terms of the jobs and the work that's available to businesses, is also a part of it. And that's so another part of the government scheme, of course, is to create work in ways that will allow people to utilise the people they've got and to want more of them. And be that some of these projects will clearly be temporary in nature. Some of these infrastructure, horizontal infrastructure in particular, type opportunities that might arise will provide work opportunities and training opportunities. They won't last forever, but ideally they will create a platform on which longer and more sustainable growth will occur. So it's about, we've got to have something to start with. And even if it's not particularly flash work, if it's giving the right skills and allowing people to finish their apprenticeships and become viable in their own right, of course, every individual who qualifies as a tradesperson is a viable business in their own right if they put their mind to it. So we need to get into that point, and any opportunity is worth taking.
Oh yeah, you're really singing our tune, that's for sure, because we have been talking about this for a while. And I think it's actually really good to see the government at the moment talking about their procurement policies. We've seen some issues with the prisons, for example, with DECMIL now in liquidation, not working in New Zealand anymore, and it's caused some headaches for the government from that major project. It'd be really great to see those projects with New Zealand-owned companies in them, but that would need a change to their procurement policies, that they use New Zealand companies, but more importantly, any company that tenders must have trainees. The government's starting to make noises about this now, and I'm hoping it's because of the advocacy that the likes of Master Electricians and Business New Zealand have been doing. So how easy is it for the government, I guess the question is, to change those procurement guidelines to become procurement requirements? They have to have trainees in their companies that tender for their work.
It's not difficult for a government to do that. The question is which particular criteria are to be used. And this conversation about the government driving access to work through its procurement policies is not new. It's been going on for a very long time. But it's ebbed and flowed depending on the government that's in power, for instance. And so, for instance, a government that says you can only have a government contract provided that you are taking on trainees and apprentices would be something that you could easily support. It's not so easy to support, for instance, the fact that if you are a company that wants to get a government contract, that you have to be fully unionised, collectivised, and a bunch of other more socially oriented policies attached to it, which generally incur costs. So the bottom line is that the incentives should be about the growth of jobs and job opportunities, the value of jobs. Clearly, everybody wants to have well-paying jobs, but not so bound by other criteria or regulatory criteria that the cost of doing that becomes prohibitive. So there's a balance required, and that's one of the reasons why we haven't seen a lot of action in that space, because there's this perennial contest, particularly as governments change, about what the really relevant criteria are.
That's good. I hope that we can get some traction on that, because we'll certainly be pushing that barrow for quite some time to come, because I think that's a critical factor in getting rid of the skill shortage that we have, or reducing the skill shortage that we have. I guess if we hark back to the days pre-COVID-19, and we're an SME country, it's some people would say it's actually too easy to start a company, but that would sort of hamper, I think, our entrepreneurial spirit that we have in this country. So being that it's so easy to start or give birth to an SME, but the issue is that we've got an exceptionally high death rate of these SMEs, before we take COVID-19 out of the picture. Do we have a reason why there's this high death rate of SMEs?
Well, if you look at any country, SMEs typically have the highest churn rate of any particular part of the economy. But if you look at New Zealand, you just touched on it. We're a can-do attitude kind of people. And a lot of people who start up small companies or operate as sole traders do it because they don't want to be somebody else's employee. They want to be their own boss. So there's that part of the attitude. The other reason why there's quite a lot of high churn is because of that attitude, people reach a point in their lives where saying, I've done what I needed to do, I've got the money in the bank that I need, and I don't need to grow. Because what kills businesses is either of two things. One is that they can't pay their bills and they die through that means, or they don't want to grow to the next level because that's not where they want it to be. I mean, if you're the inventor of some startup market, and you start in the garage, you expand from the garage to the rented shed, to then your own premises, and then finally you start to expand offshore. Each of those is a fundamentally important stage in a business's life, and many people choose not to take the next step. They would rather effectively cash up and use that for the next stage of their lives, be it retirement or anything else. So there's an attitude aspect to why we see a high churn in SMEs as well as a practical one.
Okay, so it could just be that it's a statistics and lies issue that often the businesses might just shut down because, as you say, they've achieved what they wanted to achieve and they've moved on to something else.
And there is also the point, to your earlier point, that it is extremely easy to start a business. You can pretty much start one in about half an hour by filling in some forms. The thing is that people don't realise that the practical realities of things like that first year of provisional tax that you don't pay until the second year, and all those sort of very, very practical issues that bite later after you've taken that easy step to start the business are also a factor in people becoming resilient enough to get past that first hurdle and to become sustainable.
Yeah, and I have to admit, I started a electrical contracting company when I was quite young as well, and had absolutely no idea what I was doing. I have to say it was probably the hardest thing that I've ever done in my life. And it was a massive learning curve, and I guess on that learning curve, if we want to try and I guess correct the faults of the past maybe to a certain extent, but you know the tradie companies at the moment that are going to go under, do you think there's anything that they could have done in their general business practice prior to COVID, if they had them in place, any practices in place that would probably have saved them now when times are getting really tight? I know it's an exceptional circumstance, but you know we do have this economic cycle where we go up and down anyway. This has probably just taken us more quickly in the downward spiral. So I guess just anything that a practice that could be put in place by tradies that would save them a little bit in times like this.
Well, I keep coming back to that cash flow thing, but in terms of startup businesses, it's about having enough resilience to get you past that first 2 years. And that often means, as many of your members will know, is starting up means that you basically put everything you have into the business. You take almost nothing for yourself other than what you need to live until you have built up that buffer that allows you to take the first hit. Generally speaking, that's that first year of provisional tax. It's the first biggest hit for most businesses. But then something like COVID comes along and you lose income. That buffer is what saves most businesses. And those that don't survive, generally speaking, don't find a way past that buffer. It's not just about making sure you've got enough work coming in to pay the bills from revenue. It's making sure that if you haven't got the revenue, you can find other sources of income that you can sustain the payments on the capital side of things as well. So there are ways around managing short term, but if you haven't got the resilience in the first place to manage even that, and a lot of businesses fail because they live hand to mouth, cash in, cash out, and that's a recipe for disaster when something hard happens.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess that's what maybe a business can do, is can work on their resilience by ensuring that they've got that cash flow. What about government? Is there anything government could have done or can? I know they're pumping a heap of money in as an incentive now, but in general, in the down cycles of the economic sine wave, all electricians will know what I'm talking about there. But when we're in that downward part of the curve, as we're heading to that, what can government do in general to smooth out that, as we all know the terminology now, smoothing out that curve, flattening that curve?
Yeah. Well, the things that they can do is to make the bureaucratic side of things less step change and more incremental or more curve-like, in fact. So if I use that example I've used before of things like provisional tax, that's one big hit, generally speaking, for the average business, and then it starts to become more regular and more manageable. But smoothing those first hurdles and allowing people to ramp up in ways that allow them to manage each smaller incremental step, is something that governments can do, and they can do that by looking at the way that they manage their tax mechanisms, and then the other support mechanisms that go with it in terms of things like the working for families environment and others, looking at how they contribute to the whole. And one of the things that we've always said to governments, and all governments are guilty of this, they tend to operate these sorts of things in silos. When the working for families environment is about smoothing the income proposition for families, when you look at the overall figures, though, you find that the lowest income families are often paying negative tax because the transfer payment side of life is higher than the tax burden they would have had if they were earning. Smoothing those things and integrating them with other areas of the economy, like the tax system, would in fact allow the government more control and more leniency and more flexibility in how businesses operate. So there's a lot of work that requires integration of government functions that would go to that answer. There's no one single thing. It's a package of things that work together as opposed to independent things operating separately.
Yeah, that silo working environment is destined for failure, really, in any business, I think, and happening in government, it's probably not helpful. It's probably a big thing to turn around. I know the government are pushing through these, what they call shovel-ready projects. I actually don't like that term because it sort of insinuates horizontal construction or civil work, and I don't think that contributes a lot to the vertical construction sector, but they probably do have some shovel-ready projects that are vertical. Is this government, I don't want to pick on Labor, but they're typically not a government that you would associate with this big civil project work. So this sort of seems to be outside of their mandate, really. Has their hand just been forced in this to gear up these shovel-ready projects?
Well, I think their hand has definitely been forced, because we're now looking at predictions of something of the order of 10% of the workforce being out of work. And if you look at history all the way back to the 1920s and the depression as opposed to recession, the governments of the day have always had to find things like so-called shovel-ready projects to engage people in, to keep them active and engaged and available for future growth and work. So there's that aspect to any government having to do it. This government, like previous Labor governments, has typically focused more on the social response than the infrastructure response, and therefore perhaps its thinking needs to move a little bit more towards what does shovel-ready mean. I take your point. Shovel-ready sounds more like cutting tracks and planting trees than it does about building buildings and rewiring the electricity system or something like that. So what we need to do is identify work that needs to be done now, can be done now with the workforce we have available and the resources we have available. And I think we're doing too little of that. We are effectively going out on a search for saying, has anybody got a garden that needs to be dug? And I'm being a little bit simplistic there. Okay, well, we need 6 people to go and dig the garden. That will help at some levels. But at the moment, we already know, for instance, that the horticulture industry is desperately short of the migrant labour it usually uses for its work. And so we're now seeing airline pilots going and picking kiwi fruit. Now, that short term will help the cash flow for that airline pilot. It will not help either the kiwi fruit industry, for whom that was not a long-term proposition, or the pilot whose skills are being lost to the world over time. So what we need is not just projects that get people with a shovel or a screwdriver in their hands, but projects that allow them to either sustain the knowledge and skills they've already got and to bring them back to where they can optimize the potential that they actually have. And that requires more than just a list of projects around the regions. The other thing too is recognise that we do have regional problems in the sense that some regions have a huge surplus of labour now. Queenstown, for instance, the tourism industry has fallen apart, and there are thousands of migrant labourers for whom there is no other viable work because they're either legal requirements or their legal limitations with visas limit what they can do. And of course, their financial situation is that they can't move. So we have to look at balancing out what we can do for all of those things as well.
Yeah, no, I guess that resilience that you referred to at the start of this was quite a critical factor in businesses surviving. So, excuse me, just wondering, electricians they can be quite specialised in some of the nature of the work that they do, and I guess this in its nature does not build resilience. When if you have a company that is very narrow in their income streams, it's obviously critical to get them to broaden those income streams. I guess, are there any industries or companies that have a diverse part or nature to what they do that have come out of this okay, but because certainly I know a lot of electrical companies are struggling with, particularly in the rural side where they specialise in dairy or industrial, they specialise in industrial electrical engineering. So are there any companies that industries that are actually just naturally diverse that have come through okay?
I think there's a variety, but I think you touched on the industrial companies that have highly specialist requirements, like a paper mill for whom the electrical work is primarily things like rewiring motors, or the things where it's highly specialised and is not likely to occur elsewhere. They'll either if they shut down, those people will be on a market that they'll find it hard to get work in. I think part of the answer is to encourage individuals themselves to start taking on more learning. So that, for instance, that electrician who specialises in rewiring motors, if the work is starting to turn down, is alongside their employer and with government assistance to start saying, what more electrical knowledge can I gain? What more electrical skills can I gain so that I actually become a versatile labour unit, if you like, or and available to other people that I can supplement my current situation with. So it's not just about what can an employer do or what should a government do or who should pay for what, but also encouraging individuals to grow their own knowledge and skills. And so I think rather than looking at companies that have survived by being diversified, it's also getting the companies that are specialists to say, what can you do to diversify your people so that they are viable in a range of circumstances, both for your good as well as for the economies.
Yes, building for the future. So
yeah.
Yeah, well, look, I could probably talk about these subjects all day, but I think as a broad overview of where we sit and that this has been very valuable. I think that there's probably about 4 or 5 things that I'd like to maybe progress over the next few months or years that we can take to government and try and lobby for. So for our first podcast, I think it's great that Business New Zealand has been involved in this, and I'd just like to thank you, Paul McKay, very much for being a part of our initial launch into the digital age. So thank you very much.
An absolute pleasure. Great to work with you.
Thanks for listening to What's Up. Please make sure to check out all of our other social platforms and head over to our website for all Master Electricians digital content. See you next week.